Leaders of the rival Tigrayan People's Liberation Front will be among those pardoned in the amnesty. Government forces have been fighting the rebels for over a year in a war that has claimed thousands of lives. The surprise pardon comes amid a lull in the 15-month-long conflict, which has recently seen government forces retake the initiative and capture several rebel-held towns. But there was no mention of further negotiations with TPLF rebels, who last month said they were ready to enter talks if the government released political prisoners and ended a 7-month siege of Tigray that has cut off food and medicine to the region. According to state media, among the prominent TPLF figures being released under the amnesty are Eskender Nega, a founding member of the party, and Abiy Ahmed, a former president of the Tigray region. Ethiopian authorities have also released opposition party leader Eskender Nega after he served 1.5 years in prison. Eskender, who founded the Balderes for Genuine Democracy party, was charged with terrorism in September 2020. The former dissident blogger and journalist was arrested early last year after riots that followed the killing of political singer Hachalu Hundeza in Addis Ababa. The charges followed a wave of unrest sparked by the death of the singer, who is revered by many Oromo people, which are the biggest of Ethiopia's more than 80 ethnic groups. At least 178 people were killed in Oromia and in the federal capital.
Well, to explore these recent developments, we're now joined by Dr. Awol Allo, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Keele and a regular political commentator on Ethiopian affairs. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
I'm not quite sure where to start, because the two issues that we want to look at seem quite contradictory actually in nature. So let's start with the release of political prisoners, because it's a narrative that the Ethiopian authorities want to paint about seeking peace, national reconciliation and unity. And then we'll talk about the airstrikes, which seem to go totally against that. Tell us about the rationale behind the release of political prisoners.
You're absolutely right, Peter. There are two processes that are ongoing right now. One is a peace process that is intended to bring about the end of the armed conflict in the north and in the Oromia regional state. On the other hand, there is what is being referred to as an inclusive national dialogue process that is designed to address long-standing political questions in Ethiopia that is ongoing. So the release of the political prisoners, as stated by the government, was intended to open up space for that inclusive national dialogue process. But the question really is whether the government is genuinely committed to an inclusive, a truly genuinely inclusive national dialogue process, because the government is already saying that the Tigray Defense Forces, the Oromo Liberation Army, those who are in armed struggle against the government, are not welcome to participate in the national dialogue, in the national dialogue process. But in order for a country like Ethiopia to come to terms with the underlying political problem that has started since the founding of the Ethiopian states in the late 19th century, it is important that all stakeholders participate in this process. Now, the political prisoners that were released, there were three categories representing three different political constituencies. One is the Tigrayan group, so people like Jawar Nega, and then you have major political leaders representing the Oromo ethnic groups. You have some individuals representing pan-Ethiopian political actors such as Eskender. But the most important here are the Oromo groups, Jawar Mohammed, Bekkele Gerba, and others who were arrested in the aftermath of the assassination of the Oromo artist Hachalu Hundeza.
All right, so again, they're selective about who they release, perhaps figures that are quite well known and prominent. But we've been hearing stories for months about ordinary Tigrayans being rounded up in the capital Addis Ababa and detained for prolonged periods of time just because they're Tigrayan.
Look, the repression in Ethiopia over the course of the last year and a half has been extensive. It is so pervasive that the surveillance of individuals who are opposed to the government extends down to the village level, to the household level. When it comes to ethnic Tigrayans over the course of the last 1 year since this war started, you have a significant number of people who are civil servants working in the police and the military, the armed forces, who were rounded up, put behind bars simply on account of being ethnic Tigrayan. And the Prime Minister, the Ethiopian Prime Minister himself, in a speech to his cabinet, admitted the fact that people were being picked up simply because some individuals saw them at the individual level as a threat or because they belonged to other ethnic groups. The same problem in the Oromia regional state where the Oromo Liberation Army has been fighting. And also you have differential treatments in terms of the political group that has been released. So, for example, the Oromo Liberation Front, which is very popular within the Oromia regional state, has so many leaders that have been arrested since they returned back to Ethiopia in 2018. Those leaders have not been released, and it is totally incomprehensible how the government would decide, for example, to release members of the Tigray People's Liberation Front and hold the Oromo Liberation Front. If the thinking is that the Oromo Liberation Army is fighting against the government, well, the Tigray People's Liberation Front is also fighting against the government. So there is a differential treatment on the part of the government in terms of who they are releasing. And ultimately, if you are selective in terms of who you want to take part in the national dialogue process that is intended to address the country's long-standing political problem, then you are really making a bad beginning, which can only lead to dead ends and create further problems down the line.
Then, of course, we have this tragedy on the border with Eritrea, a camp for displaced people, 56 dead, 30 injured, and the authorities have been denying targeting civilians for some time. And I wonder if we can read into the fact that they've been reluctant to comment on this tragedy. 56 people dead and an airstrike.
The tragedy in the Tigray regional states is just incomprehensible. The Tigray regional government, as you reported, stated earlier, pulled back to within the borders of Tigray, expressed its readiness to enter into negotiation. The Ethiopian government at the same time declared that it would not advance into the Tigray regional state, and people assumed that that would create an opportunity for both sides to de-escalate the military confrontation and come to some kind of negotiated settlement. But the drone attacks, particularly against civilians, are inflaming tensions further and making the possibility of a peaceful negotiated settlement very, very difficult. Now, as I said earlier, this question of negotiation that will lead to the end of the military conflict is central to the success of the national dialogue process as well. And those who have just been released would most likely demand that the government include the Tigray Liberation Front, the Oromo Liberation Army, into the national dialogue process. If the government continues with this armed strike, I think the process would lose public trust and public confidence. It would simply complicate the possibility of reaching any settlement for Ethiopia, again, prolonging the crisis that is destabilizing the country already.
In terms of war and conflict, there are rules of engagement that are generally accepted worldwide. Geneva Convention helped map the way to manage conflicts. One of the things is you cannot kill civilians. The Ethiopian authorities seem to have done this. Could this have been a mistake?
You're absolutely right. One of the most important principles of international humanitarian law, this is a course that I actually teach at the moment, is what we call the principle of distinctions. Parties to the armed conflict are expected to maintain the distinction between civilians and combatant, and civilians are to be protected. Not just civilians, but also civilian objects, civilian infrastructures are to be protected at all times, and violating the principle of distinction constitutes war crime under international humanitarian law. And unfortunately, this war have seen so much atrocities. And I think the idea that rules apply in war, in an armed conflict, doesn't seem to be something that is taken into account in this war. So when governments use drones, for example, weapons that do not really kind of subscribe to the principle of distinction, where the weapon that you use doesn't allow you to distinguish between civilians and combatants. When you attack areas where there are a significant number of civilians, then that creates a problem. It makes it very difficult to uphold the principle of distinction. So it's unfortunate. I hope there would be accountability for these practices. But you are absolutely right. This is a war that has been characterized by war crime, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. Maybe in some cases, there is even a case to be made for genocide to have occurred in Ethiopia.
This will make it exceptionally difficult for Abiy Ahmed and Addis Ababa. They were already under enormous pressure internationally, and they've been deflecting, saying things like the US is interfering in the sovereign affairs of Ethiopia, that the foreign media are trying to write a certain narrative, but there's no hiding or doing any kind of downplaying when people are killed and civilians are killed at an internally displaced people's camp. What will this mean for Addis Ababa and international pressure?
It's quite tragic in terms of how the Ethiopian government and its supporters tried to legitimize and justify this war against its own people. You would be surprised to find out the way in which, for example, Pan-African discourses and ideas have been manipulated and used as if the war Ethiopia is fighting is a war that is being fought on behalf of the African people, the black population, to resist colonialism. It's a very tragic whitewash of very xenophobic, very racist practices as Pan-African practices. But of course, this is going to be very difficult for the government. The more you have this bloodbath and ethnic polarization, it makes eventual settlement very, very difficult. You know, while I see the steps by the Prime Minister to release these political prisoners as an important first step, it is important that the government goes further. You cannot have a national dialogue process that is inclusive and capable of resolving Ethiopia's central political problem while an armed conflict is ongoing, while you are targeting civilians, particularly the kind of targeting that happens based on people's ethnic identity. The individuals that were currently released from prison, particularly those of the Oromo Federalist Congress, are people who are committed to a peaceful resistance process, people who have worked very hard in the past, responsible even for bringing Abiy Ahmed and the Prosperity Party to power. These individuals could help this process. But of course, it is important that the government recognizes how deep this crisis is and the kind of commitment that it takes for the country to move forward.
Dr. Awol Allo, we're going to have to leave it there. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for trying to make sense of these tragic events mixed with these release of prisoners. We're trying to figure out what it all means, but thank you so much for your insights tonight. Thanks for having me. All right, that's Dr. Awol Allo from Keele University in London, speaking to us about this tragedy that's played out in Tigray, north of Ethiopia, where 56 people have been killed by an airstrike. Ethiopian authorities at this stage have not been commenting on what happened, but 56 people dead, 30 injured. We'll keep on top of that story for you.